Tinder Date by Monique Choy. Alistair Vasey was bigger than he looked in his profile pictures. The armchair seemed almost too small to hold him. Celia sat beside him with her limbs tucked away out of courtesy. She had chosen this wine bar because it was cosy and cool, with couches and haphazard chairs giving it a relaxed lounge room feel. The lighting was flattering and low, and the music was just loud enough to provide a wash of privacy over a conversation. Of course, the trade-off was you had to keep yourself compact and your belongings, be they bags, coats or legs, out of the way so the staff didn't trip over. But not Alistair Vasey. He stretched his long legs across the floor, taking up a conspicuous amount of space. Maybe he had to, Celia thought. He walked with a cane and a slight limp. It was possible he could not sit with his legs bent. Deal breaker? No, of course not. He was clearly fit and healthy. His forearms, protruding from the rolled cuffs of his blue shirt, were lean and hard in a way you didn't often see in Marrickville. And his skin was sun-browned and freckled from working outdoors. He had shaken her hand as soon as he arrived, a formal gesture made without self-consciousness. When he touched her, she noticed that tiny nicks and cuts roughened the pads of his fingers, and that these small serrations were stained a tea brown, though he was perfectly clean. It was as if soil had seeped into his skin, the way cigarette smoke can turn fingers yellow. There was something straightforward about him she immediately liked. He didn't seem to have lied about his age either. 48 seemed about right. And he really was handsome. The profile pictures almost didn't do him justice. Celia flicked her eyes back to the menu. Oh, she certainly was colourful, this Celia. What was she wearing anyway? A kimono? Looked a bit like she walked out of the house in a dressing gown. But Alistair liked it, the gutsiness of it. He imagined Celia walking down the main street of Wanderlock in that get-up. She'd be like a parrot among the sparrows. Wanderlock women wore polo shirts and jeans almost everywhere as far as he could tell. But here he was in parrot habitat. The walls in this joint had pictures painted onto them, straight onto the plaster, and even the picture frames were painted on. And the young guy who was pouring 2 glasses of wine down on the tiny table between them had pale pink hair like fairy floss. Well, wasn't that exactly what he was looking for? The reason he'd travelled all the way to Sydney to see who he could meet? Something a bit different. "Shall we get some cheese to go with the wine?" she asked him. "They have a great white mould here." He raised his eyebrows, bobbed his head. Best to nod along. She spoke to the pink-haired fella, complicated instructions about the kind of crackers and the colour of the olives, her red lips flashing. Blonde hair tied up in a wispy sort of way, dangling earrings, a low-cut top that slipped across the swell and dip of her breasts. If anything, she was too pretty. Lately, he'd been thinking that what he needed was someone a little plain, someone who wasn't going to turn the head of every bloke. Someone like Cole's wife, Kylie. She was no looker, that was for sure. But Kylie was solid. Cole could rely on her. The two of them, Cole and Kylie, were like bedrock. He thought of the time after his accident when he was stuck in hospital. Cole took on Alistair's harvest on top of his own, organising contractors and getting out there in the paddocks himself into the early hours. Cole had worked like a dog, barely sleeping, but he got both crops in. And he made it clear that it was Kylie too, on the phone, making arrangements, up in the night, keeping Cole and the boys fed and watered. Yes, Cole could rely on Kylie. He just had to reach out and she was there. And Alistair had noticed lately that Cole always gave her credit. He watched this Celia, moving her hands all over the place while she talked, flamboyant, drawing attention to herself, like she was sending out semaphore signals. He looked around the room to see if everyone was staring. Not particularly. Well, parrot habitat. He could see she had a little fire to her, and he liked that too. You knew where you stood with a woman like that. You weren't expected to read between the lines all the time. Yeah, he'd wait and see. He sipped his wine. Nice drop, actually. He didn't say a thing about the wine, which was disappointing. How could he not love it? So, you live out of town? She asked. Oh, yeah? He shifted in his seat. Yeah, I like to spread out. My place is by the river and I've got a couple of houses up on the hill. A couple in town as well. A real estate magnate. Nah, it's nothing special. You know, they're usually rented out to contractors. Celia nodded sagely. Her friends were lucky if they were halfway through a mortgage on a terrace house. But that was Sydney for you. It was probably different in the country. Does your ex-wife live nearby? Yes, she was forthright. So what? No point in beating around the bush. That would just be a waste of both their time. He bent over and scratched his ankle. Yeah, she's not far. Easier for the family. And you live near your ex-husband? He was uncomfortable talking about himself. She'd put him out of his misery. Actually, I've got 2 ex-husbands. Might as well get it out there. It was a good story anyway. Oh, yeah? Yes, the first time I was only 22, young and stupid. He was a surfer, with every cliche that entails. My father hated him, of course, forbade me from seeing him. So we eloped to Bali, just to cement the cliche. I thought it was so glamorous, but as soon as the plane touched down, I knew I'd made a terrible mistake. But I was too proud to admit he was a dud. Surprise, surprise, it only lasted 6 months. Married and divorced at 22. She sipped her wine. There it was, the story of her first marriage, worn smooth and shiny over years of telling like a river stone. It usually raised a laugh. She liked to tell this story because otherwise she knew she could seem a little bulletproof. It showed that she wasn't ashamed of that mistake. It made people warm to her. But not this guy. Right. He'd been leaning a little forward to hear her speak, but now he sat back in his chair like he was making a point, taking her measure. She bristled. She had been young and stupid, and she wouldn't be judged for that. Whatever. She moved on, for some reason, feeling the need to keep talking. She told him about her 2 teenage boys from her recent marriage. She avoided the details. That story wasn't so smooth and social. It hadn't been sanded down to remove its barbs. He watched her talking. That Bali story put him off. Marriage was not the sort of thing where you just threw in the towel. He had well and truly learned his lesson about women who think like that. Even now, he had no idea why Marion had left. Well, maybe he had a few ideas. Maybe he'd said things he shouldn't have said. Maybe even took her for granted once in a while. But he really didn't see it coming. He didn't think she'd just up and leave without any warning. Alistair needed a woman with some grit. Someone who could push through the bad patches, like sticking it out through fire and drought and brimstone and what have you. You don't sell up after a couple of bad years, because a thing that comes good after a rough trot is worth something. He'd always thought that an easy ride was like drinking lolly water, and Alistair was no fan of sweets. There she was, wearing that bloody silly pale orange dressing gown. But then, females liked pretty things. That's just the way they were built. He thought of his granddaughter, a cute little thing, always dressed in a ballet tutu. You couldn't get her out of it. She wore it round the house and into town and to the dentist too. And there was no harm, he told his son. It was just a little sweetness, and it didn't hurt to indulge her. Well, maybe he had changed his tune after all. And here he was, 48, and someone's pop. While this Celia still had 2 young kids at home. Different phase of life. He decided not to tell her about the grandkids. Celia kept talking, compulsively filling the airspace between them. Why did she do that? Meanwhile, Alistair's eyes were roving over her body. Faces up here, buddy. But it was a date. Maybe he was allowed to check her out on a date. It was exhausting being thrust in again at this age, trying to read the signals. She felt too old to play these games again. She'd been on exactly 4 Tinder dates since the marriage ended. From her point of view, they seemed to go well. Good conversation, a few laughs, but then no follow-up. She'd dropped them a line, but they either fobbed her off with a blunt one-liner or didn't bother to reply at all. She had no idea what sort of criteria she had been assessed on, how exactly she had failed their tests. It could rip your confidence to pieces if you let it. Lucky she had a thick skin. But she got a different vibe from this guy. He was listening to her closely. Stuff was landing. He didn't like her barley story, but to hell with it. She certainly wasn't going to tell him about her second marriage, the minefield of pain it had become, how she tried to stick it out for the boys' sakes, but it got to the point where they couldn't be in the same room with each other without spitting poison. Nothing was off limits. Her hair, her weight, her job, her laugh, her parenting, her driving. Nothing. And she damn well gave as good as she got too. Not that it mattered in the end. She'd made herself so numb to his assaults that sometimes she wondered if she'd ever be able to feel anything again. Celia was weary. All she wanted now was some peace and companionship. Someone to sit with and maybe share a pot of tea. Of course, it was critical to keep these longings hidden, so she kept the conversation light. She asked about his dogs. He had 3 of them, which seemed a bit excessive. And then there was Anna waving from across the room and making her way between the tables to reach them. Oh, Celia stood up to greet her friend, but Alistair's hand was suddenly gripping her wrist. She looked down and saw with horror that she was about to step on his outstretched foot. She froze, one foot hovering in the air. He hitched his hip in the chair and moved his leg out of her way. Oh, God. She was useless, really. Her ex was right. If there was a way to fuck something up, she would find it. And worse, she could tell from his face that he had seen her self-loathing. She shoved it down. "You're right," he said. He even gave her arm a little squeeze, which made her cringe. She had exposed a weakness, and he had one over on her now. He could use it against her. And then Anna was there, her eyeballs darting rapidly between them. Now Celia was hugging a woman with one half of her head shaved and the other half hanging along. But who was he to judge? She introduced him, but he couldn't get out of the chair so quick. He put his hands down to brace on the armrests, but Celia flapped her hand at him. "Oh, no, it's fine. Don't get up." He saw the other woman appraise him quickly, take in the cane and flick her eyes away, like he should be ashamed. At home, it was just the opposite. His limp brought out a kind of sentimental admiration in people. The whole town knew the story. He'd flipped a quad bike when he was fighting a fire. His limp was a badge of honour, like a war medal. And why not? Huh? A scar means you've lived through something and come out the other side. But here in the city, well, he was just another lame sucker getting in the way. That was the main trouble with the place. No one knew anyone else's history, the story behind the scars. So they spent all their time trying to hide them. Celia sat back down, a little flushed from her conversation. She dropped her hands in her lap and looked around on the ground for something to say to him. The silence, coming straight after the busy chit-chat with her friend, was painful. But then she started up again, thank God. She could talk all right. He didn't like answering the get-to-know-you questions. He was happy to just nod along. Truth was, this dating stuff was a thing he wanted to get past so he could just get on with his life. He recognised that he wanted a woman, that he was lonely was the best way to put it. And he had plenty to offer a woman. That's what Cole said anyway. Big house, beautiful land, some of the best land in the district. And he didn't have to do much work on it now. He had the boys sorted out. He could ease up a bit, sit on the veranda with a cuppa and enjoy the view. But he couldn't approach the women he knew. They were sniffing around all right, some of them, but there were always strings attached. He couldn't just pick up with the ex-wife of a mate he'd known for 40 years. How could he look the man in the eye? So he'd come all the way to this funny little bar on what was probably a fool's errand. This Celia. She was comfortable in her way. Her instinct was to steer him through this date. They both knew she was driving and he was grateful for it. But she was probably too youthful. What would she want with a granddad like him? She was in her element in the city. How would she go stuck out on the farm? Or would she expect him to move? There were a lot of question marks, and that was assuming he had enough to draw her, enough to hold her. Oh, how did they get started on politics? She knew better, but it had been almost impossible to draw him out. She'd tried every topic under the sun. It was only when she'd mentioned her volunteer work on the river that she'd really engaged him. And how on earth could you talk about that without talking about the impact of colonisation? And of course, he used glyphosates himself. Let them run into his own river. He was the sort of automatic conservative who just puts it in neutral and repeats the stupid things he's been told. Well, fuck him. She wasn't going to abandon her convictions just because he was good looking. She was over it, accommodating men, be they husbands or sons or fathers. But then it happened. In her passion, she knocked over his wine. She breathed in sharply, stopping mid-sentence to watch it run off the table and seep into his neat jeans. His going out jeans, probably. Oh, God. She knew what she looked like. Face flushed from the wine, eyes a little wild with anger. She was making a fool of herself again. Now it would come. He'd make a remark, mention how much she had drunk or the mad disarray of her hair. She pulled her robe back onto her shoulder and straightened her spine. Whatever. She willed him to say something. She'd rather have a sharp truth, even a cruel truth, than have him ghost her the next day. But he was looking at her mildly, a little crinkle of amusement in the corner of his eye. "You've been volunteering on that river for 10 years?" he asked. "Well, it's not going to improve overnight, is it? That's unrealistic." He nodded at her slowly, thinking something. Her lips were tightly pursed. Her eyes were narrowed. Even her toes were tensed inside her shoes. She was in battle stance. But it dawned on her that maybe he wasn't planning to attack. "I'm impressed," he said. "It's quite a commitment." She breathed out slowly, consciously unclenched herself. She wasn't sure what to say, so she picked up a napkin, tipped water onto it from the bottle on the table, and handed it to him. He took it and dabbed at his jeans. "It's a shame. That was a very nice wine," he said. "I'm really sorry for spilling it all over you and raising my voice. I know I can be a bit full on sometimes." He looked up at her for a long moment, then returned his attention to his jeans. "Don't be. I'm enjoying myself. And I realise I haven't thanked you for planning this lovely evening." He laughed a little. "I think you're going to ruffle some feathers in Wanderlock." Thank you.